So, while big companies like Activision and Microsoft and Electronic Arts are being lauded for bad internal business practices, poor development cycles, and corporate decisions overruling game developers or customers, including the ever-present threat of DRM issues, voters at the Consumerist caused EA to be named the worst company in America this year.
I honestly think that EA deserves it for how they do stuff.
EA blamed it on the Mass Effect 3 ending. That's kind of why I'm mentioning this, is multiple endings. Now the Mass Effect 3 ending basically only changed the color of certain aspects of the CGI and had nothing to do with the ending itself, aside from the randomized who walked out of the ship at the end thing. So, there was oh man, I should have put this guy's whole name. But there's a quote that it said, it's not just over Mass Effect 3's ending, it's over Origin, it's over Project $10, it's over the early server closings, it's about the DLC, charity abuse, and it's over them gutting studios like Pandemic and Westwood and Origin Studios and Brightlight, it's over the lawsuits, it's over the nickel and diming with the Day 1 DLC, it's everything else in between. By and large, there was an argument that, what's his name, Pachter? Anyway, the EA spokesman, he was claiming that if it was done by a scientific sort of vote, companies like Bank of America would have been far, far above EA.
Activision I remember the consumerist thing.
Yeah.
This is from consumerist? Oh, I just thought it was declared by some legitimate company. Okay, consumerist, that's a whole different story. Still,
consumerist was one of those review sites.
I consider consumerist a waste of time, but that's just me. You know, that is just me. Don't start frothing people. That's just my opinion. But as it comes to game companies, EA, yeah, if they took away all that stuff, EA would still be a horrible company to me and still worst game company, despite their practices and how they treat their developers and everything else.
EA's pretty garbage. Just gonna throw that out there.
Yeah, I can't fathom how their developers tolerate that. Seeing it in Maxis was the new SimCity, that you could tell it's being rushed a little.
Yeah, it's just that EA is not an honest company, and you're not gonna get very far if you're not an honest company in the eyes of your consumers.
It's a company run largely by a board rather than the creative aspects or even the business people behind it. It's more about getting profits than it is the actual market.
It's shareholder based. That's the problem that I see with a lot of game companies. The shareholders don't care about the quality of the games. The shareholders care about making more money.
And that was a concern about Activision there for a while, but they seem to have been kind of straightening themselves out a little bit. I don't hear them in the news nearly as much as I used to, except for when its president tends to mouth off once again.
Yeah.
We went completely another direction.
Well, no, this is actually part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
The differences between the Japanese, because they're without their problems too. Square Enix is one of their probably
Square. We gotta admit that at one point, Square didn't give a shit what the community wanted. They did whatever the hell they wanted.
And that's pretty much been the case for that time period we were talking about, between the 2002 and the 2010 when the industry nosedive. And it's only been in basically the last year, after the horrible outturn of what happened with Final Fantasy 14 and 13 and several other canceled RPGs, because there was like spin-offs left and right of Final Fantasy 13, and we got one of them. One of them I'm pretty sure is still in production, but the other two kind of disappeared, and it was a really weird marketing decision anyway to have basically 5 games with the same name.
Yeah, it was crazy. I think it's great
necessarily
that
related.
Yeah, I don't know what they're doing. They were spiraling out of control. I think it's great they actually started listening to the community, because now that you see that they're listening to the community, just people's view to Square Enix is going back up now. They're just like, hey, these guys listen to us. It ain't like before where sometimes you would say, hey, we want this, and Squaresoft was like, oh, you want this, and they would do the complete opposite just to remind you that they're the bosses.
Square's had a very interesting record. I mean, if you go all the way back to when Final Fantasy first came about, they were a struggling company. That was the whole point of why that game got that name. Fantasy. They expected it to be their swan song before the company shut down, and it just happened to be the next big thing, and it carried the company over. They pretty much were on top of their game, and the only reason they started having problems again is because they poured so much money into that whole movie studio that they set up in Hawaii. That was this big international project, and after the failure of Final Fantasy's Spirits Within,
horrible movie,
it crashed.
Oh, it wasn't very bad.
Well, it was just a storyline that was horrible. I liked the CGI. The CGI was fantastic, and some of the things they did in the movie were awesome. Like where they dropped out of planes and they shot that gel stuff down and they landed it slow down. I found that blew me away. I was like, that's awesome.
I only
see,
had
that's-
2 problems with that movie. One, it should not have been called Final Fantasy. Yes, it had remnants and hints and such, but for the most part, it was its own thing. If it wasn't called that, people wouldn't have went there with something else in mind, especially coming off the heels of stuff like Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
And the second one
Yeah.
is the ending. Right about the point where they go dropping into that crater at the end of it. Up until that point, it was a pretty strong movie. After that, it kind of went somewhere else. And I have to say, it's not an insult, but the Japanese have a really hard time writing a good ending. I have seen a lot of anime in my time. I've seen a few Japanese movies. They all have a really hard time ending.
It's
I
almost like
agree.
they don't think of the ending when they write the series. They just say, oh, this would be a cool idea, let's do this. And then all of a sudden the series is coming to an end and they have to make up something off the top of their head.
It does seem like that a little bit. I think part of it is because on the one hand you have the idea, if this is successful, I can keep it going. So they leave the ending kind of...
That's
They-
true.
And on the
They
other
have-
side, Japanese culture is kind of very reflective. So having an ending that's very melancholy isn't at all unusual, where here we like closure to our endings unless we know there's a sequel, or unless there's a great twist involved. So having a melancholy ending of, well that was nice, or, oh that was sad, and that's about it.
I
But
think,
yeah, Square.
I think Advent Children was a fantastic ending for the Final Fantasy VII stuff.
Yeah. If nothing else, it was a great letter to the fans.
Yeah.
Anybody else probably would have thought it was awful, just kind of flashy CGI stuff that was kind of cool from that aspect, but as far as story-wise, what the heck did I just watch?
Yeah.
But to the fans, I wish they would do that kind of stuff more often. I'm actually glad to see the latest CGI Resident Evil actually be a better movie than any of the Resident Evil live-action.
I tell you, is it mean? Because I actually had a couple people that told me, "Oh, Advent Children sucked," and I was like, "Did you play Final Fantasy VII?" And they're like, "No," and I was like, "Then your opinion has no reference at all because you didn't play the game."
Yeah. And I think that's I know this is a topic for when we actually talk about video game movies, but I think that's a problem when you do directly relate a movie to a video game that way. You're going to lose a lot of your more casual audience.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I think we might need a little more of that than what we have been getting. But again, that's a whole show there. So then when Square actually started getting back on their game in the early 2000s with the rather runaway success of Final Fantasy X and among others, that things were looking up for them again. And they were kind of becoming the EA Activision of the East because they started buying up a lot of smaller companies, the more famous of which being Taito, the creators of games like Bubble Bobble and
Seventh Saga.
yeah, and then in more recent years, they took over the UK-based Eidos and all its subsidiaries. So they had access to games like Legacy of Kain and Thief and Hitman, Deus Ex, and of course Tomb Raider. And I think that was part of their early understanding that they knew they had to grab their Western audiences again because they were losing them. And so owning a Western company would bring them more into the end because Just Cause 2 was one of their bigger games of that year. I mean, it sold about as well as Final Fantasy 13, if I'm not mistaken. But Square has been trying to pull out of all of this. All the concessions they've been making with the Final Fantasy 14 by revamping it, retooling it, getting it ready to be a more legitimate game than the mess it was. They're refocusing on the titles that they know people want, even though Kingdom Hearts 3 still does not even exist as a blip on the radar yet.
Come on, Final Fantasy Tactics.
There you go. There you go. They're also making marketable gaming engines. Both Konami and Square have made their own, Luminous for Square and the Fox engine for Konami, to help boost the local Japanese game developers to keep up with the growing tech behind our Western engines like the ever-upgraded Unreal and Cry engines. So they understand that the technology has to be bumped up a little bit because, granted, the bigger companies like Capcom, Konami, and Square, they tend to keep on the ball, but just about everybody else either feels like they're still making a PS2 game or what might as well be a launch for one of the next-gen systems, even in 2012. The technology isn't really there keeping up with what the American groups have been doing. And how many games have been made by Western groups? All of Metroid Prime was not done in Japan. It was done by, I believe, a UK-based, or Canada-based. The Lords of Shadow, the successful God of War knockoff version of Castlevania, that was done by Westerners, and the list could go on and on.
It just seems that the Western world has learned from the things that Japan did, and they've, like I said earlier, adapted them to their own forms of game design. So you have like a mishmash of the two that improves each aspect on its own.
One of the main problems with the Western market is that they have a stagnation problem.
Yes.
You got your sports titles, you got your MMOs, you got your RPGs, you got your first-person shooters. They're really good at them, but there are so many of them that are so interchangeable. I mean, there's some really creative aspects that different groups will put out to make themselves stand out from everybody else. So you know there's some real creative talent. But at the end of the day, you could really put games like BioShock and Halo and Call of Duty side by side. They're not so dissimilar. I know people are going to go, what? But think about it, just 1 minute. Think about the core mechanics of those games. You could interchange those. Now, there is a lot of difference in as far as storytelling and ambience, and of course, we're talking one that's back in the 50s underwater. You're talking another that's in outer space with Space Marines. You're talking about another that's more modern, set in an arcadey, modern warfare environment. So there are differences. Do not get me wrong. You've got the hacking in one. You've got the heat-seeking lasers on another. You've got vehicles. You've got multiplayer differences. But really, as a gameplay design, they're all first-person shooters with almost the exact same setup. And this is the same case with MMOs. We've talked before about how many of them try to be WoW killers and end up being basically WoW with a different genre attached to them.
Addressing the WoW killer thing, it's like we've said before, the only people capable of killing WoW are Blizzard at this point. As for the first-person shooter dilemma, I agree with what you say largely, except for BioShock. I know it's an underwater 50s soap opera type thing, but I think there's enough differences in the gameplay and the design itself to set it apart from games like Halo and Call of Duty and Battlefield.
It comes down to the mechanics of it. See, I'd almost not include BioShock myself because it actually has almost as much in common with Fallout 3, which I don't find Fallout 3 fitting the same mold as the other first-person shooters because it's more role-playing game than it is shooter.
Well, BioShock, you had the different abilities, though, and you had to find them within the game.
There's a more narrative aspect to it, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is sadly rare. But there's other combinations of RPG and first-person shooter. I would still stick in that list. Borderlands. Now, I'm not saying any of these games are bad. I'm just saying that the fact that they're using such a similar style of gameplay that it makes it easy for you to jump into the next game, but you have to step back and realize how much stagnation is going on there because everybody is making different variations of the same game. This is the equivalent of people calling PlayStation All-Stars a Smash Brothers clone, or Crash Bandicoot a Super Mario clone. It's exactly that sort of thing. But once people got used to the genre being accepted in there, that's when it became everywhere. Sometimes there was actually some innovation actually involved, which is why so many of them aim for that multiplayer component, which is also kind of a major difference between East and West for a long time, is the West really focused on multiplayer. And this is where it's strange, because the East, Japan especially, it has so many people in a so very enclosed space that playing games with each other is a lot easier, because the internet was so much better in some cases. I know there's certain areas that weren't quite so much. But that's why so many of the handheld games had head-to-head battle stuff. It wasn't so much built for the American audience as it was the Japanese, because they love that. The completionist aspect, the collecting aspect,
They love group games. They love them.
They love long, difficult games, too. Which is why I think a lot more of the Japanese games back in the day, at least, were so much harder than most of the American ones.
Final Fantasy IV.
Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I know we've mentioned it before, but
Mystic
called
Quest.
Final Fantasy USA because it was dumbed down version of the standard Final Fantasy, because Americans didn't like, or so they understood it, the long involved grinding. They didn't like the difficult gameplay, so they made an easy version of Final Fantasy, which, ironically enough, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is not exactly a pushover game.
It's a very fun game. It's fun. It's not exactly easy. I mean, it's not exactly hard for a hardcore RPG player, but it'll give you a little difficulty.
Mm-hmm. But it's a lot more like what RPGs, even Japanese RPGs, have turned into now. I can't say that too much because I know the Tales series has really been carrying the JRPG market for a long time, and I am sad to say I have yet to actually play one. I've played snippets of some, but to actually play one, and I know they're alongside the more obscure niche stuff.
I think if we wanted to choose a hardest Japanese RPG, it would be Seventh Saga, just without question. The main thing everybody always says when you're playing Seventh Saga is you're going to get to a point where you're going to jump to the old world. You're going to be thrown into the past. Oh, spoiler, but now you know. Too late for you. Should have played it a long time ago. Anyways, if you're not level 40 when you do this, you're screwed. You cannot continue. You cannot even attempt to fight these monsters. You gotta start all over. And, that's just the difficulty there. It took me 2 games to learn that when I first played it. I think I was like 13, realizing, oh man, I have to start all over.
And a lot of those games didn't have the multiple save options back then, so I don't know what the zone's going to be like. I'm going to save in this slot. That usually didn't work that way.
Yeah.
While we're on the games for a little bit, I'm going to steer it to some of the stranger aspects, because I know a lot of American games, especially in the indie game, well, not just American, but the Western game market, they really try to find weird stuff. But in the more mainstream, you don't see a lot of really dangerous attempts at genre breaking, unless it's from somebody like, I don't know, Double Fine Studios or somebody like that. And it usually does not pay off for them, sadly enough.
That's a very good point, too. You don't see that many indie games coming from Japan.
Actually, you do, but it's a very specific kind, and I definitely want to get into those a little bit.
Is it the good kinds or the bad kinds?
A little of both.
Oh, okay.
You've got these really weird ideas. I mean, Katamari Damacy was a big success, but when you really think, even if you take the weirder aspects, the whole King of the Universe, or was that his name?
King of all Cosmos.
You take some of that aside, you take the weird cow stuff and the dancing, you take that out, it's still a weird game. You're still about this little dude rolling a ball that's like velcroing everything to it until it's a gigantic star.
I love that
Who
game.
comes up with something like that?
Yeah.
I still have in my head the first time I bought that game for PlayStation 2 and put it in. I just remember watching the intro and just like, what the hell is it? And this is amazing.
There's an entire meme that's called WTF Japan.
Yes.
I know the website too.
Yeah, it's a collection of all the crazy things Japan has ever done in pretty much everything. And there's some real doozies in there.
There's really crazy games. There's some I've mentioned, if I could think of the names of them, like that involves a girl that gets really gigantic and kind of Godzilla style is marching everywhere. And then there's the one about inflating things that is really bizarre and strange.
Yeah.
There's LSD, the Dream Emulator. I do remember that one. I think that might have even been an indie game. I don't remember that one having an actual official publisher-developer relationship. I could be wrong there. And then you've got Mr. Mosquito,
I have that.
where you basically are playing a mosquito when you're trying to suck the blood out of stuff without being noticed.
I remember that
is
game.
Crazy.
That game is awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. Just because I can't explain. It's just fun.
Come on now. Then you've got series like the Cho Aniki series, which seems to be a little on the homoerotic side. Very famous for all its muscle-bound guys in skimpy speedos. And it's usually shooters, but not always. For example, the reason I know about it, there is a fighting game. Now, this may not seem weird at first, but think about it for a second. The whole Beatmania series, so you've got specifically the one that was a gigantic fad in the States for a very long time, DDR. And it has turned into the whole Let's Dance and all the other dancing games that's come out since the Wii and the Kinect and stuff. But think of the concept of DDR for a moment. That is definitely a Japanese concept if you put too much thought into it. Because at most of our interactive stuff was like running in place on the power pad. We were not exactly a society known to really jump into our video games that way.
Well, we made movies about it, though, virtual reality and stuff like that.
True. But even then, it was usually standing in place with some sort of headset on and going, ooh, Lawnmower Man style.
That's true.
So getting up in front of people, it's like the equivalent of karaoke in a lot of ways. Getting in, especially when you consider that the Japanese are almost cut down the center. That one side is extreme introverts and the other side is extreme extroverts.
Yeah,
DDR
really
is one of
crazy.
those things that brought both of those sides together. And I'm sure it did the same thing here in the States. I think that's one of the reasons it was so popular. And it kept arcades around for several years longer than I think they probably would have. Still sorry to see those go. But yeah, I think before we run out of too much time here, I will go ahead and they do have an indie game market. Well, they call them doujins, and there's really about 4 different kinds. There's the DDR types of games, which a lot of times you have to use your mouse or something like that, or a keyboard, where you're keeping up with rhythm stuff, and it's often off of various pop anime songs. The other one is the fighting game community. There is a ton of homebrew fighting games over there, but the 2 biggest ones is the bullet hell games and the visual novels. They've never really stopped building shooters over there. The old top-down, you're shooting forward, 1942, all of those. And Toho, this little unknown thing that came out of nowhere by a guy who basically created all the characters, designed the game style, created all of the art, did all of the music himself, and said, here you go, no copyright. So there's been tons upon tons of other people that have expanded on this universe with their own variations of the shooters and turning it into other things like puzzle games and fighting games and platforming games. The famous one is that Rosencrantz Stilette? Is that it? You played it, Mike.
That's the Mega Man one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it Rosencrantz Stilette?
Something like that, yeah.
But yeah,
It was a long time ago.
And then visual novels. Now, this is probably what they're best known for, because there for a while, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s when they took off, it was one of those things we looked at Japan and, what are you thinking? Because half of them, probably more than half of them, were dating sims, where it was all about doing these really intricate things to win over a specific girl out of these lots of different girls that you could have interacted with to end up in the, yeah. But a lot of them got very rated R, rated X, which I think is another reason why they were so popular, to be completely honest. And then there's also a whole set of them that were a lot more serious. There was murder mysteries. There's kind of fantasy RPG elements in some of them that actually included leveling up. And there's several of them that are tactical RPGs, like this guy in Final Fantasy Tactics. Some of them are Dojin, some of them are full release. A lot of them ended up becoming anime. That's another thing you see a lot of. A lot of games becoming anime and anime becoming games. That seems to go hand in hand even more than over here, where Western is very, very infamous for making basically a video game off of every single franchisable movie and TV series it could possibly think of. I mean, I know everybody does it, but I think the United States is the worst about it, because it can be a cartoon series or a movie that you would never think. Did you know that the Will Ferrell movie Elf has a GBA game?
Oh my god.
I think I remember that.
Home Improvement has a platformer game for the Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
There is so much of this crazy stuff. Why would you make a game based off of this? But yes. So there's that.
A lot of the video games that were based off of things like TV shows, though, were not met with great degrees of success.
No, it was very rare that any time a licensed product was all that good. That's why stuff like GoldenEye was such a big surprise.
Yeah.
Pleasant.
And it got to the point where I questioned why they still did it, because it was a well-known fact in the gaming community that if you bought a licensed movie game or a TV show game, you were probably wasting your money.
But they still sold.
Yeah, they still sold. I never
Largely
understood.
to kids, and I think that's why so many of them are themed more toward that route than they used to be. There's a lot fewer. Well, we talked about this in the horror game.
Them dumbass kids will buy anything.
Or their
Well,
parents.
yeah, I was getting ready to say, it's their parents too. They would see it on the shelf and be like, oh, he likes watching this. He'd like this.
Mm-hmm.
Or, oh, she likes Hello Kitty. We'll get her the Hello Kitty game, you know. It's not as common now because parents are not as uninformed. I mean, you can't...
There's still quite a few of them out there. They just seem to be for older systems. It's like the end of the life cycle means all the shovelware suddenly shows up.
Yeah, PlayStation 2.
Yeah.
Still going. But yeah, you can't hardly walk into places like Walmart and Target, sure, but if you're specifically shopping for a game and you go to a place like GameStop, you can't put anything on the counter without them commenting on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of what I like about them. They're like, are you sure you want it?
Yeah, they let you know their person behind the counter will give you their honest opinion, even if it is their job to sell the game. You'll, more often than not, at least from my local GameStop, I generally get a pretty honest opinion of the game from the people that work there.
I know we already got into the companies a little bit, but I have to mention Capcom at some point because it has taken a lot of flack in recent years. A lot of it, on the one hand, because of some of the business practices, like especially in the last 2 years, they've done stuff like the Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which was supposed to be a big love letter to fighting game fans who's been waiting for over a decade for a sequel, and it had some problems. It wasn't as bad as I think everybody was making it out to be. I still don't understand how people can turn on a game so quickly when they barely played it yet. I see a lot of that anymore. But they upgraded it to Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 within 8 months, which made the original a big thing. They really publicized. They made... Heck, I was one of them that got the collector's kit, and I don't usually do the collector's thing.
Me too.
But that was one of the many things. They canceled how many iterations of Mega Man games? There's at least 4 of them that I know of.
Legends 3, Universe, those are the 2 big ones.
There was the Korean MMO, and then there was the their Mega Man collaboration thing that I don't remember the name of. And probably the biggest one they got flack for was the on-disc DLC that was on Street Fighter Across Tekken, which, to explain that to the few people out there, the game came out on the disc, with the future plans of several, matter of fact, the most DLC characters I think I've ever seen on a game, to come out later because there was a deal with Sony about getting these characters on the PSP before they showed up on the games later. But this was a deal that was inked after the characters were already being developed, so they were on the disc. However, Capcom wasn't very honest about all of this, and most of the characters that are on the disc are nearly completed. And they were asking quite a bit of money to unlock these 7 months later, actually, because I think the game came out in February and they weren't released until like September, July, somewhere in there. And I still don't know if the PC owners ever got their DLC.
And this goes back to that whole can't be dishonest as a game company with all the social media and internet access that everyone has. It'll always come back and bite you.
And a lot of Capcom staff has left them too. Seth Killian, who probably left under the more favorable circumstances, is largely a reason why the fighting games made a comeback here in the United States, and he's kind of become a staple to the fighting game community. And he left recently to start working up with Superbot, who working with Sony. More specifically, Shinji Mikami, the Resident Evil creator, also left Capcom about the same time that they shut down Clover Studios, which had made games like Okami and the other big one that is completely Beautiful Joe. Anyway, the employees renamed themselves to Platinum Games and began working with other companies, specifically Sega, before Shinji Mikami himself left to head up Tango Gameworks. Now that is a division of ZeniMax, which is a growing multimedia company headed up by a really big celebrity list. They're largely known for owning Bethesda for Fallout and Elder Scrolls Skyrim and all that type of stuff. Arcane Studios for Ox Fatalis, and recently Dishonored, which is doing very well. And id Software from Doom and Quake fame, so they have quite a staple that they just bought into. So that's a case of Japanese moving west. And even bigger than that one was Keiji Inafune, co-creator of Mega Man and producer for games like Onimusha and Dead Rising and many others in the last decade. Left Capcom in 2010 after a lot of publicity about his statements about Japanese gaming industry falling behind American market design and among other things. He went on to start up a company called Comset, who made its early appearance in a big collaboration JRPG series called Hyperdimension Neptunia about anthropomorphized consoles as anime girls, which he even included his own face as one of the summons. So Capcom is a strange beast because on the one hand, they do what everybody else does and gets hate for it. And on the other hand, they don't do what everybody else does and they should and get hate for it, if I made that clear enough. Even though they've made a lot of failures, I think probably the biggest dropped ball, even bigger than the games that I had already mentioned, was Lost Planet 2. Because Lost Planet 1 came and went, it had some fans, but mostly went largely ignored. And when 2 was starting to come out, people were getting really excited about this. From everybody that I've ever heard play the demo early, before they understood what happened to the game later, really loved the demo. And somewhere in the remaining 3 months before the Christmas season, and it was one of those rush things, somebody made a decision to completely overhaul several major aspects of the game, and it completely changed everything, long story short. And it played nothing like what everybody was expecting. It had many flaws. A lot of people bought it and they hated it. And this was just followed up by Dark Void just a little after, which I believe was actually created by a Western company in this case. But it was still a major fail. Once again, it was borrowing aspects of so many others while trying to do something really new and creative with this whole vertical aspect, because you're a guy with a rocket pack, so you're doing as much climbing up the side of these towers, diving behind cover, as anything else. But once again, it was just, we'd seen this with Gears of War and Call of Duty. It was nothing really new. Controls were bad too, and controls are always something really important.
I played the demo, and it was the controls that lost my interest.
So after all of this being said, it kind of becomes obvious that companies on both sides of the ocean have a lot of trouble. And they have their own little unique problems and their own unique strengths. And it's just a matter of, can they get their act together before the market fails? Because we have lost so many companies this year. We have lost so many talented people who are just leaving the industry altogether. Some more talented than others.
I don't think that the industry is going to fail, because there's a lot of really good games still coming out that are indie games. And I have found myself enjoying the indie games a bit more than the AAA titles lately.
I don't think it's going to be an all-out crash where we see no video games anymore. The consoles are dead. What's left is a minuscule of PC.
I think it's just an evolution that's going on in the gaming, just like it is in the publishing for books and everything else. These old companies are trying to do it the old way, and the old way is not working so well anymore, and they're starting to see it.
It's just like Nintendo with its refusal to embrace the online market for so long. It's hurt them for it.
Mm-hmm.
And for doing the proprietary systems waited so long to get out of the cartridge into the CD, and when they did, their CD wasn't as fast, nor did it hold as much information as the big guys, so it hurt them there. But they managed to pull out by doing what they did best. And I think that's one reason why Nintendo's more of a success story than a lot of the Japanese game companies, because even though they're still doing things the old way, they're doing it in a way people can still get behind and enjoy themselves with.
They're doing everything that Sega didn't do, and the reason Sega's dead.
So I think we kind of went all over the place, but hopefully we got some of the concepts of the whole East versus West, Japan versus the world going on here. But that's our show for this week. Join us every Monday for the next PrinnyCast. We may be changing days, and we may start doing part 1 one day, part 2 the next day. This not only allows me a little more time to do the editing, not rush around quite so much. I don't know that a lot of people are really watching the whole thing at once after all. It's still better than the 4 or 5 parts that we were doing, but going all the way through, because we're still getting a lot of people watching part 1, and about half that watching part 2. So I don't know if that's just people starting in on the show, not liking it, and moving on, but it seems to be the same amount every week. So maybe YouTube is screwing up their subscription boxes or something, and they're not seeing part 2, or
It could be people just watching the news segment also.
that's very possible. So it may be every Monday and every Tuesday. We'll see where it goes. You can catch us at Twitter at PrinnyCast. You can catch our email at PrinnyCast@gmail.com. And don't forget Grover's channel. He's going to be the
Bye.
Yes. So, till next time, everyone.
See you guys later.
Next time.